Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
Since January, if you've been paying attention to any level of national news, I'm sure you've noticed the new presidential administration has been moving at a very quick pace toward their promised policy agenda, making changes and signing a slew of executive orders. President Trump so far has signed at least 55 executive orders targeting a wide range of policies from domestic spending to immigration policy.
Yeah, and today we're focusing on immigration policy. The president has really made it no secret he intends to shake up the status quo for how the United States operates when it comes to people seeking amnesty, refugee status, and migration, both legal and illegal. President Trump has promised a campaign of mass deportation as well, and we know that there have been some efforts toward that nationally, but just how that's taking shape, especially in New Mexico, it has obviously sparked a lot of questions, some fear, and definitely much speculation.
Yeah, you might be wondering, how does an ICE raid work, for instance? That is the U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, for those who aren't familiar. Who could be targeted? We've seen people in our border state reacting also from a place of fear. So we're bringing in some of the experts in the law today to dispel some of the misinformation and rumors that you might be hearing or seeing on social media, but also to talk about what is happening and what rights people do have. Let's introduce our guest, Sophia Genovese, the Asylum and Detention Managing Attorney with the New Mexico Immigrant Law Center. Sophia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just start high level and to timestamp ourselves, because this will not air on the day that we're recording. We are recording this in mid-February, just before Valentine's Day. Tell us about your role with the Immigrant Law Center. And prior to 25, let's go back in time. What was your job typically focused on here in New Mexico?
Sure. So NMILC has several legal departments. I oversee our asylum and detention programming. I'm working with people who are seeking safety. They've fled horrific persecution in their home countries, maybe political violence, maybe cartel violence, or something else that was driving them out of their country and up to the United States. So I work with individuals who are both not detained, who are out living in New Mexico with their communities, and people who are detained at any of the three detention facilities that we have here in New Mexico. So we work with people who are fighting off deportation in the immigration courts and who are forced to navigate really complex policies. Even before the Trump administration came in, it felt like asylum policies were frequently changing, and that no doubt continues. Our other legal departments serve people who have typically lived here a little bit longer. So we have a survivor advancement team. They work with victims of horrific crime, people who may have been trafficked or sexually or physically assaulted. And we have an unaccompanied minors team. They work with immigrant youth in applying for permanent status, as well as a team who supports DACA recipients in filing for DACA renewals, people who are renewing their green cards, as well as people applying for citizenship. So we run the full gamut of humanitarian protection. We are the only statewide nonprofit who provides free legal services to immigrants all across the state.
I had one question about, some of the people you work with, because I think when you see national news and you see the people that get interviewed on them, sometimes there's a tendency to think, well, that's not here in my local community. That's just elsewhere in the nation. But, as you're saying, you work with people in New Mexico who have these experiences. And I just wanted to maybe home in on that is, you do work with people who have some of these very real experience. There are people in New Mexico, it sounds like, as you're saying, that do have these true stories about fleeing violence, correct?
That's absolutely right. The populations I work with are very diverse. They have the common trait of fleeing their home country for a very specific reason. So right now, there's a lot of political instability in Venezuela and Colombia, but also Ecuador and Peru. People have been tortured. They've been tortured by criminal organizations. They've been tortured by their governments. They are fleeing really horrific danger. People don't take that decision lightly. It's really hard to immigrate to a new country. You're leaving everything you've ever known behind and trying to seek safety in a place that you might not share the same language or culture. And so it's a really difficult decision that people make when they are coming to the United States. And I think that's often forgotten. And it's not talked about, it's not respected. People are coming here to seek safety, to create a better lives for themselves and their family. The people I work with truly want to create the best situation for themselves, to work hard, to contribute everything they have to their new home.
We know that since President Trump took office, it sounds like you've gotten a lot of calls about this. We even had one of our reporters, Melissa Torres, had spoke to you about this earlier this year. A lot of calls from people seeking, advice or maybe asking questions, maybe people who are not U.S. citizens. Seeking advice and guidance. So are you still getting that high volume of calls, and are you still getting the same types of questions as the months have gone on?
We are receiving thousands of calls, hundreds of emails, lots of inquiries when we're just walking down the street in our communities about, hey, I have this question about my friend or neighbor or family member who doesn't have lawful status. What can they do? There is so much to the immigration system. There are a lot of different forms of relief, but at the same time, it's not something that everyone is eligible for. Not everyone can just apply for a green card. You can't just get in line because there's no line. There's no general application for citizenship. So it's getting that baseline information out into communities about what forms of relief do exist. And for people who may not have those options, making sure they understand their rights in the United States, because people who are undocumented do have rights here, and ensuring that they are protected and prepared for what comes next.
And what is the number one question you'd say you're getting?
How can I get my papers? How can I apply for status? And then again, it's just a lack of general awareness because the immigration system is so complex. I mean, even asylum law, which is a narrow subset of immigration law, is more complicated than the U.S. tax code and changes more frequently than the U.S. tax code. And people are forced to navigate that system frequently all by themselves without a lawyer. And so that's just one subset of immigration law. There's so many other forms of relief and protection that people can try and apply for. And it's hard to find information about what those requirements are, but not only what the requirements are, the process for applying for that status. So we work really hard to educate communities about those forms of relief and do our very best to provide people with intakes and consultations, but there's just not enough of us.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like the answer to that number one question is also complex. You can't just send people, go to this website, click on this button, and there's all you need to know. It sounds complicated.
That's right. And we have produced a community defense manual, and that is accessible to the public, where we attempt to put everything in one place about the process and forms of relief and what those criteria are. But even then, there's nuanced analyses that have to take place before someone can really apply for status. So it's really complicated.
Mm-hmm. So again, we're recording this in mid-February. I was chatting with your deputy director over the weekend. One thing she brought up that I think is important to note and just let people know is that so far there have been no confirmed ICE raids in New Mexico to date, right?
There has been targeted enforcement. So ICE has identified people for arrest. There have not been mass raids where people who are unknown to immigration authorities are picked up. That's correct.
Yeah. So, and you guys are aware that there have been people contacted, individuals by ICE, maybe not during a raid per se, but maybe contacted by immigration enforcement. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So we have a rapid response team and have received about a dozen reports of enforcement operations against people in a variety of situations. So initially, we were really concerned for people who had old deportation orders, and we assumed that they would initially be targeted for enforcement. That has not been the case. We've had people with pending asylum applications who are known to immigration authorities be detained at their homes, at their businesses, is and during their regularly scheduled ICE check-ins, where they have an appointment with their deportation officer, who's sort of like a case manager. They've been detained at these appointments in large part because of the national quotas that the administration has announced, where each field office is required to detain 75 people per day. And who is the easiest to detain? People who have been compliant with their ICE appointments, people who are in the process of regularizing their status and have to keep their address updated. So those are the people who have been targeted.
That's interesting. We saw the New Mexico Attorney General also recently put out guidance on immigration enforcement for community leaders, sort of letting people know when their rights are on, or what their rights are rather, on certain properties. So this speaks to some of the questions that I imagine you all are getting, some of this guidance that is being put out there. So let's talk about some of them. First, it sounds like if someone comes to your home claiming they are with immigration enforcement or ICE, does that person have to open the door?
No. It is exceedingly rare that ICE will have a valid warrant requiring you to open the door or allowing them to open the door by force. What typically ICE does is print a piece of paper that says warrant for arrest. It has the Department of Homeland Security emblem on it, and that is not enforceable under the Fourth Amendment. You need a signed judicial warrant by a judge within the past 14 days, clearly specifying your address and clearly specifying the scope of the search in order for that warrant to be enforceable. And again, ICE almost never, 99.9% of the time, will never have a valid judicial warrant. And so people can ask to see the warrant, but at the end of the day, ICE will come in if they actually have the authority to come.
That's good to know, because we also know there's probably scam artists out there who say they are with one agency and might not be with said agency.
That's exactly right.
Okay, let's talk about schools. Schools typically have been considered protected areas, warranting caution before any immigration actions are taken on school grounds, meaning unless prior approval was obtained or under exigent circumstances, immigration enforcement is typically avoided on school grounds. But with federal policies always subject to changes, let's talk about what is and what is not allowed on school property. What kinds of policies can schools themselves put in place regarding immigration enforcement?
When it comes to public schools, immigration enforcement is allowed on the public areas of that property. They are not permitted into the private areas of that property without, again, a valid judicial warrant, which they never have. And we are encouraging schools, and a lot of the Albuquerque schools already do this, but having a locked door policy, a requirement that all visitors and non-school personnel check in at the front desk, having someone designated at the school to interface with ICE officers if they do come to the school and verify whether or not they have a valid judicial warrant, and then respectfully asking them to leave if they do not produce that warrant. And so that goes for public schools. With private schools, it's private property, and so you can immediately ask ICE to leave, again, unless they have a signed judicial warrant.
Which that sounds like just general safety protocols too, making sure visitors check in at the front door and we know who's coming onto school premises, right?
Exactly. I've been really impressed with the schools that I have visited where they have a key card system to get into different buildings, and I think that's great for general public safety.
You know, you mentioned ICE almost never, you said 99% of the time does not have these judicial warrants. Would you expect that as time goes on that perhaps that becomes more of a thing that they will have to get, or you'll see them getting? A judicial warrant obviously requires a judge in the courts, and that takes time and a review of cases. But is that something you expect to see more of as time goes on, potentially?
I have never personally seen it. Anything is possible, but there's a lengthy process that they would have to go through to get that warrant, instead of maybe staking out someone's home or workplace where they can try and approach them in a public space instead.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
I understand as well, some of the legal guidance on this subject indicates that I think it's federal law that states immigration and law enforcement officers must comply with the Fourth Amendment. Law enforcement could approach and ask somebody questions about their status without any level of suspicion, as long as the officer, quote, does not act in a manner that would cause a reasonable person to believe that they're not free to leave. So someone can't be detained without any probable cause or reasonable suspicion, right?
That's right, but that doesn't prevent ICE officers from approaching them still. ICE officers are allowed to engage in what police engage in, which is being allowed to lie to people, try and trick people into saying their name, into divulging the countries that they hail from or what their immigration status is or lack of status. And so it's also important for people to remember their Fifth Amendment right, the right to remain silent, and ask over and over again, am I being detained? Am I free to go? And if you're free to go, then walk away slowly and calmly, not slowly, quickly and calmly to get out of the situation.
Okay. And that speaks to probably some of the advice that you're giving folks of what do I say if somebody approaches me on the street and starts asking me about my status in the country? Mm-hmm. What would you tell them?
I'm invoking my right to remain silent. Am I being detained? Am I free to go? And then walk away. When there are situations of searches, especially at the checkpoints, you can invoke your right to not consent to a search. A lot of times, police and ICE and CBP immigration officials will try and trick someone into consenting to a search. Hey, I can take a look in your car, right? Can I take a look in your trunk? Is that fine with you? Trying to really persuade people to consent to a search. People need to remember their rights and feel confident in asserting their rights to not consent to a search.
Got it. A coworker recently came up to Chris and I in the newsroom and just shared with us that her middle schooler came home upset, saying there was a video that kids were passing around at her school talking about ICE raids, and that some of her Hispanic friends were scared to come to school. This seems like a fairly new thing that we're hearing about, and it's hard to fact check things that your kid might be seeing on somebody else's social media account at school.
Especially these days, there's just so much video and video creation tools that just, people can make a video in an instant making a claim that's really hard to debunk.
Yeah, especially, say you're the parent who doesn't give your school that cell phone. That doesn't mean they're not seeing things that are scaring them at school. So I wanted to bring this up because this seems like a problem. Should middle schoolers and their parents be scared to go to school at this point?
Everyone needs to make their own assessment about what types of risks they're willing to engage in. And it is heartbreaking that we've gotten to this point where there is so much fear in the community. There is a lot that the executive has said that is simply not going to be able to get carried out, especially with a federal hiring freeze. And there are very real capacity limitations to what ICE and CBP can and cannot do. At the same time, people can't help but feel fear. They can't help but want to take precautions to protect themselves and their families. And that's not something I could advise on. It's not something schools can advise on. It's really a personal decision. I think the schools in Albuquerque in particular have done an incredible job of quickly standing up precautions and policies to ensure that the students and their privacy are protected against ICE enforcement. I think it's an open question about what else the state can do to support immigrant communities and not collaborate with ICE in enforcement operations so that, law enforcement officers are not out on the streets with ICE conducting raids and detaining parents. It's an incredibly impossible situation, and it's up to every family to determine what kind of risk they are willing to engage in.
Mm-hmm. And not saying, like you're saying, people are obviously allowed to feel fear, but would you, I guess, advise somebody who's saying, well, I'm so afraid I don't even want to send my kids to school. the policies that you've seen put in place in Albuquerque, do you feel confident that their kids are safe in school at this point?
Absolutely. Albuquerque has done a really great job of protecting the students in the school. Where the danger lies is out in public spaces. So maybe a family member can think about safety planning to get their kids to school safely and back home safely.
So we know the Trump administration has really put emphasis on their priority, as they say, of immigration enforcement, being against those who've committed crimes. Earlier in this, though, conversation, we talked about who are these quotas and who are the easiest people to find. It's actually those who have been checking in through their normal sort of expected amnesty check-ins, those seeking amnesty, I should say. So we know Albuquerque as well. They call the city itself has passed a resolution. It's been in place since, I think, 2001 or so, and iterated on over the years. But the city calls itself an immigrant-friendly city. And with that, there are specific policies the city has against keeping data related to migrants, or anyone related to their status, rather, I should say. But is there data, though, that exists somewhere out there for those who aren't in the country legally? And how many of them have been in trouble with the law or committed a crime? Is there some sort of database that checks that you know of federally or in the state or locally?
Sure. So the local policy is for local law enforcement to not refer immigrants to ICE for any kind of enforcement. That exists at the city level, and there are efforts at the state level to make that a statewide policy, to not cooperate at all with immigration enforcement and to leave that responsibility to the federal government. There's also a separate statewide bill being led by Somos, and I believe it's up in committee today, on preventing data from being shared with third parties. And that's all of our data, not just immigrant data, but preventing that data from being shared with third parties, and not allowing that information to be thereafter shared with immigration and customs enforcement. So that's MVD data. New Mexico does allow driver's licenses for immigrants regardless of their status, and preventing that data from getting into the hands of third parties who then sell that to the federal government, who then may use that information to conduct enforcement operations. When it comes to people who have any kind of criminal history, whether that's an arrest or a conviction, the federal government has at its disposal robust background checks. So what Albuquerque has chosen to do is not participate in that enforcement of immigration law. They are solely focused on criminal law and the criminal process, and have divorced itself from the immigration process. It is then up to ICE and the federal government to conduct those background checks on individuals and engage in their own enforcement using their own resources, not state resources.
So it sounds like it would be a lot more work for them to try to find that data. It's not readily available in New Mexico as easily as maybe some other local municipalities.
I think that's right. I think we also have data everywhere, right? Data is accessible in a variety of ways. It's not some single system at the state level. I think there's a variety of ways that the federal government can locate someone if they want to.
We also know the Santa Fe Archbishop and local priests here. We have a lot of Catholics in New Mexico. Priests here gave guidance to their parishioners about immigration enforcement. Can you talk to us about churches and, again, what people should be aware of when it comes to places of worship?
So similarly at churches, depending on if the property is private or public, immigration officials can be present on public property. They cannot enter the private spaces of a church campus, for example. So if there's private residences on a church campus, making sure it's clearly marked that this is private property and no unauthorized personnel are allowed to enter that space. And then remembering that, again, immigration officials need a valid judicial warrant to engage in any kind of search, to engage in any kind of questioning, and empowering church officials and church leaders to kindly ask and respectfully ask immigration enforcement to leave, because they will never have that valid judicial warrant.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcast and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
So if someone is here in New Mexico and say they're undocumented, but they've been working and contributing to the community, what do you tell people with that status? Is there something different they should be doing at this point?
I think first it's important to think about who we consider to be undocumented, because there's a lot of people, millions of people who are in the process of regularizing their status and have made themselves known to immigration agents. And then there's, of course, the people who have lived here for years and years and have never had any kind of interaction with law enforcement or immigration enforcement. And there's a variety of situations of whether people have work permits or don't have work permits. So each of those situations is really unique, but at its core, people need to remember their rights, regardless about their right to remain silent, regardless of the enforcement agency they're dealing with too. Anything you say and do will be held against you in a court of law. That is not to say anything you say or do will exonerate you from punishment, right? And taking that phrasing and that knowledge of that right really seriously when you're engaging with any enforcement agencies. We also encourage people who have never consulted with an immigration lawyer to do so, to try their very best to do so. We're all very busy and our phone lines are ringing off the hook, but to try their best to get on a wait list so they can get a robust consultation about what their options are.
Okay. Is there anything, Sophia, that we are missing that you want people to better understand or just want to address about this topic?
I think now more than ever, we're really hoping for community members to come together and join the immigrant justice movement, the immigrant rights movement. It does take all of us to demand better of our local, state, and federal leaders. I think people should be questioning the amount of funding going into carceral border policies and immigration detention. It's $20 billion, and that money is only going to increase for immigration enforcement and detention and deportation, and that those billions of taxpayer dollars are not being spent on us to meet our basic material needs, whether that be the cost of eggs or affordable housing or medical care. Instead, it's going into the pockets of private prison companies and private contractors. And I hope we all question that.
Sophia, thank you for your time. We really appreciate your insight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again to Sophia Genovese for answering a lot of questions that people may have about how immigration can be or will be enforced potentially in New Mexico with this new administration.
Yeah, and again, I think what's interesting is, at least when we're recording this here now, it is, February 12th today? We, again, have not heard of a single ICE raid happening in New Mexico, and according to at least our look at PACER, which is the federal court record filing system, judicial warrants related to immigration enforcement outside of border territories have just not been a thing that we've seen filed yet here. So many questions and so much speculation that's been going out there.
Yeah, for sure. So get your facts from those you trust, people. Hopefully you can trust us. And if you have any topic ideas, people you'd like to hear from on our show, feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and gburknm on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV, also chris.mckee@krqe.com, and you can watch this full conversation at youtube.com/krqe or krqe.com/podcasts. Thanks for watching and listening.